unfortunately, on this. So what I'm going to do is just share the other approach of installing it. You just have to go to this particular link or this particular URL and just click on the built distribution, not the source distribution. Please click on the built distribution. It will download a wheel file. This is called a wheel, which is a binary distribution for Python. You just download this and just click on it to open it. It'll by default open with Python, and it'll install by default, just for your reference. So this is one way that you can try working around it. So yeah, either way, it should work fine. You can go ahead, try it out, and let me know if there are any issues. I'll help you through the same. Anyway, let's get back to our current case. Now, first, let's learn requests and JSON simultaneously. So we get to learn and understand both of them together. First thing I'm going to do is start with JSON. Now, for JSON, whenever we start working on it, one thing that we need to know is, okay, let's start with this. For JSON, as we know, Java script object notation, this is a common format that we use most of the time. And there are a couple of keywords that I will use ahead in time that I just want you to know. These keywords are serialization and deserialization. Serialization is where we encode a JSON data. Deserialization is where obviously we decode a JSON data. Most of the times in the scenario, whenever we work on projects large scale, we don't generally use convert it to JSON, convert it to dictionary, or encode or decode. We just use the keywords serialize and deserialize. This is the keywords we end up using. So it's quite important that we know this, because when another Python developer says, hey, you have, I'll be sending a serialized data, you just have to deserialize it and use it. This is basically what it means. So let's take a simple dictionary for reference, for us to understand what serialization or encoding means. Serialization or encoding is where we convert dictionary into JSON. This is what we do here. Let's take a dictionary called data as something like this. Let's take name, it's Jack, and let's just take some random info. Age is 30. Let's take um, whether it's a student, or rather for appropriately for age, whether we'll just take something married as false. Again, I'm using false here just so that we get to know that we can convert this uppercase F to lowercase f when we convert it to JSON data. That's what I want to show for reference. That's why I'm performing this. And let's say, let's add something else like children. Let's just add it as none for now. It could be 0 as well, but I'm just adding none. This is done purely for the purpose that we get to know how these two values are modified when we convert it to JSON. This is nowhere the ideal format of storage of data when we talk about JSON. That's one thing I just want to point out. All right. So in JSON, we have two specific functions. One is called loads. The other is called dumps. Dumps is the function that will, as we rightly looked at, serialize an object to JSON formatted string. So we have a particular object, which is a dictionary object here. We're going to serialize this dictionary object into a JSON data. So let's take JSON string and store this. And I'm just going to print JSON string, and I'm going to print type of JSON string. And I'm also going to import ice cream. There we go. Right. So this is all that we're performing right now. We're taking this dictionary and we're performing this. Again, we're just importing requests, JSON, and ice cream. Let's see how this works out. Once we run this, you get to see here is JSON string is this particular string. Now remember, JSON data is by default a string. It does not have its own class. It's just a string data. That's all it is. When you take a look at this, observe this. You have name as a key and Jack or the value here. Name again, key value again, key and value. The difference here in this value is that false is turned into false with lowercase f, and none is turned into null, which was initially none. And this whole thing is now a string. And this is what we generally send as data so that people can use this JSON format, deserialize it into their own programming language. So here's why we have this. JSON has become the standardized format to share data. It has become the standardized format to send and receive data over various web applications as well as other applications. Each programming language has its own data structure that can handle JSON data nowadays. It could be based on Java, JavaScript, Python, could be anything, just for us to understand. This is our JSON data. Once we have this JSON data, the next thing is we need to convert this JSON data back to string. In other words, we need to deserialize it. To deserialize, we basically call it as JSON into dictionary. I'm just going to take this JSON string and I'm just going to use JSON.loads dumps to serialize, that is JSON, sorry, dictionary to JSON, loads to deserialize, that is JSON back to dictionary. So let's take the JSON string here and let's add loads function to it. And let's load it back into data. I'm just replacing this data variable that we have. And I'm just going to print data and type of data. A pretty simple function, very easy to use, just two simple functions. Dumps and loads. Within dumps, you provide a dictionary. Within loads, you provide a JSON string. And it returns the vice versa of the data set or the data store. That's pretty much it. Let's run this now. You can see the data retrieved here is this, and you can appropriately see children, which was null here, has become none. That is a keyword that Python can understand. False, which was false with lowercase, has become false. Again, a value of Boolean class or a type of Boolean class that Python can understand, and it's become a dictionary. And this is basically how we utilize them. This is basically how we work around them, just for our reference. We can also store these in files and load these from files for reference. This is if you want to just store and load within program. If you want to store and load within files, there's a very easy way to do that. This is store JSON data to a file. Now, remember we have this data that we have it as JSON string. Since we have it as JSON string, okay, we'll do one thing. Let's directly use this data rather, so that we directly utilize this. We don't have to do multiple operations. We have this dictionary data. In order to store it, you use dumps function to return a JSON data. But if you just use dump without plural, it'll then store it within a file. That's the difference. That's the only difference. In order to store JSON data in a file, I just have to open a file with open of. Let's store this file as data.json. JSON is the by default extension for files like this, just for our reference. We're going to create such a file. And this as file, I'm just going to perform this json.dump of this particular dictionary. But instead of getting JSON content back, I'm going to store it in a file, and that file is this file. So let's run this and open up this file and see how it works. So if you take a look here, okay, let's see where. Yeah, there we go. You have JSON data.json file. You can just use this just to observe. This is exactly how it is: false with lowercase, null with lowercase null, and so on. That's basically how it is. You can also format this particular selection, so it looks like a proper JSON data in its observable, readable, and understandable form. This is better to understand when this is larger file. It helps us understand this in an easier way. Anyway, now that we have saved this file, let's read from this file. Our last function when it comes down to JSON, one of the last functions that we'll do here. To do this, we're just going to perform a simple operation. Again, same, read JSON file to a dictionary. Again, going to do the same thing. That is with open of data.json. This time I'll open it in read mode as file, and I'm just going to use json.load. Simple difference. Previously, JSON to dictionary, I used to use loads because I have content, but since I have a file, I just need to use dot load. And I'm just going to pass the file within it. Once I've passed the file, it's going to return the dictionary data. I'll just call it as JSON data, and you can print or I see JSON data. And this will be a dictionary, which you get to see here with the proper Python specific variables. That's pretty much all you need to know. You can handle more complicated or more complex structures, but we are just using a simple structure so far. So this is all that we need to know about JSON in short. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to know about it. Now, before we go ahead, if there are any queries, particularly within this so far, please feel free to let me know. If there are no queries, we can move ahead over to the next part. All right, so I presume that means there are no queries so far, which means we can move ahead. All right, so in that case, let's go ahead and continue. Now that we got to know about JSON, let's now move ahead with requests. Now let's remember the web page that we need to read is this dummyjson.com/cards. This is what we need to read. I just need to take this particular web. Let me see if it works without it. Of course, I guess. Okay, it redirects. All right. So this is a really good website for anyone to learn. And there's one more web page that I would highly share and suggest any developers to utilize if you would like to work on it. Um, Let me just try to recall that. Yeah, not mock server. There's one more that we commonly use. I have it um, bookmarked, but I don't recall it exactly. Um, Yeah, Bceptor is pretty good. This is one thing that you can definitely use, at least to begin with. So Bceptor can make sure that you can mock an API endpoint and test it by yourself. So you can mock any kind of API endpoint, and you can have it return any kind of data. So you can have it, you can have, let's say, a mock JSON or something like that and create an endpoint. And what does that endpoint have to return? You can specify what it has to return as well. There is generate fake data in API response. So you can test with something instead of having to hit an actual API, especially if the actual API costs a lot, for example. That's just one thing that you can try out. So I'll just share that as well. It's a common standard practice to test in case certain um, parts of the development team have not completed their tasks and you would still want to test it ahead in time. That's one thing that we often use. Anyway, let's move away from this back to our current case scenario. Right, so we have a lot of different JSON content here that you have, like you can get some product data, you can get some cards, 20 different cards or 100 different products, some comments. You can do a lot of things. In our case, here's what we're going to do. We're going to use products. Let's say, for instance, this will give you 100 different products information. And we need to obtain this info, or let's say we need to obtain rather cards. Let's make it a little more complicated because we're only going to learn one example. Let's take this cards. Now, let's learn how to grab or access web content. To access web content, we use requests module. In requests module, you have multiple functions: get, head, you have put, post, patch, all of these. So basically, any kind of REST API or HTTP methods rather that you generally use, you can get from here. If you take a look at this list of HTTP methods, there is get, there is post, there is put. You can utilize all of these. We're going to use get as of now. This is where we return some information from the browser, where we retrieved some information from the browser. And this is a get request, as we have seen within inspect just a little while ago. So we saw this is a get request. And that's exactly what we're going to do. To perform get request, just use request.get. And the important parameter you see here is the URL. What is the URL that you want to access? What is the URL that you want to connect to in order to get the response from this? That's exactly what we need to look at. So let's try this out and see how it works today. The URL I'm going to use is this. That is dummyjson.com/cards. That's the only parameter I have to give, nothing else. And once I perform this, it'll give me a response. That response will be all the content that is there in this web page. And I'm going to store this in response. That's pretty much it. Let's just run this. It'll execute and it'll give me the response. Now, here's the thing. If you print a response, it'll not give you the whole content you're looking for. It's just going to say response has something like 200. That's all it says, nothing else. Here's why. Whenever you send some information over to a server and you get back some response, this particular response that you have received, you need to be able to know what is the, let's say, let me just try to see if I can erase this. You need to know what is the status of this response. Is this response the expected response that I'm expecting? Is this the same expected response that I am requesting for? Or is there some network connectivity at my end or at client's end? Or is there some error at server end? In that case, we need to know if the response is as expected, or is there any issue at my end, or is there any issue at server end? A lot of times, whenever you access some web page, you might have seen 404 page not found errors and so on. These are HTTP or web status codes. So I'm just going to quickly walk through this. So within Mozilla, you can take a look at their documentation for status codes if you would like to later on. But I'm just going to quickly walk through them. So we'll directly get back to our current program. We can see here that the status codes that indicate whether a request has been successful or not are the following. If it's a simple informational response, it will respond with 100 to 199. If it's a successful response, it will respond between 200 to 299. Look at our response. It's 200, which means it's a successful request and we got a response. This is the most commonly used status code for responses. Most of the successful responses will be with 204. I'm sorry, will be with 200. There are some modifications of 200, like 201, 202, 203, 204, and so on. So each one of them have some specific message as well. If the web page is getting redirected, it'll be 300 to 309. But basically, you can assume that from 100 to 399, it is a proper response. We can assume that at least for now. After that, what if it's an error from my end? What if I have some network issues? That is when client error responses come up, 400 to 499. 400 means it's a bad request. 401 means you're supposed to log in and you're supposed to authenticate to access that endpoint, but you are not doing that. 402 means there's a payment required. 403 means forbidden. 404 means you're accessing a URL that doesn't exist. So these are all client-based errors. Then there are server-based errors as well. Client-based errors is 400 to 499. Server-based errors will be 500 to 599. 500 is internal server error, which is the default response. Um, Whenever there is some error in the server, which is why it cannot provide the response that you're expecting, and all these sort of things. There are a lot of different things that you have within it. So if you want to take a look at this, go in depth within this, you can. It's a pretty beautiful thing to learn. And here's why it's important to learn. In our code, when we obtained a response, there could be a lot of things that might happen. You might not have internet connectivity properly to perform requests, or the requests you're performing might not give you a response, and it might just not give you a response at all, and your call might crash. At all those times, you need to make sure that these are handled as exceptions so that your program can still run, your code can still execute, regardless of what happens. For this purpose, we need to make sure that we have all these calls to a database, to a network, whatever it might be, kept within an exception handling block so that we never encounter these sort of issues on an everyday basis. It's just something that we need to know. It's something that is a need to know basis when we start working on a coding level, because when we deploy our application, at no point of time do we ever want our application to fail and not give any response back. That's one very important thing that we need to know. That's just something I wanted to point out. All right, moving ahead. Let's move on to the next part of this. So I'm just going to write except exception as E. I can just print an error occurred during the network call, and I'll just specify that exception if such a thing happens. Going back to this, whenever you obtain the response from a request, that response is an object of a class called response, and it will have multiple things within it. Response will have something called status code. It will provide what is the status code of the response. Let's print this first. When you print response.status code, you see the status code is 200. That means it's a proper response. It's a successful response. Whenever you have a successful response, you will get to know and realize that your request is successful. which means you have got the response you're expecting, which is this content, and you can access it. So as a rule of thumb, as a developer, every request call I have ever written in code, for whatever purpose it might be, after getting the response, I don't directly take the content of response and perform some operation with it. Because think about it. What if this website doesn't work tomorrow? What if this website is under maintenance tomorrow, and instead of giving you a 200 response status code, it gives you 500? What if they remove this entire URL and tomorrow you get a 404 error stating that this URL doesn't exist? A lot of things that might occur. For that purpose, I specifically always write in my requests logic, that is, if response dot status code is less than 400, only then move ahead. Or in our particular case, response dot status code is equal to 200, only then perform your operation. Otherwise, you can just print. Currently here I'm using print, but when we write it in web applications, we use return, so that we send that information back to the front end application, which can display that to the end user, just for our reference. Anyway, let's get back to our point. If response status code is 200, here's what we need to do. We will print response.json. Response.json is going to give us the JSON content. Otherwise, I'm going to print, rather, I see we'll just use print. Web page is not accessible and responded with status code. Response.status code. The reason why I'm doing this is, if it's not 200, you will not have JSON content. If it is 500, if it's an internal server error, the server will not send back JSON content to us. It'll just send back a HTML page message saying that we are unable to access this. That's what we need to know. Moving ahead from here. Let's look at the next part of this. Sorry, guys. Please hold on for a few seconds. Yeah. Moving ahead from this. Let's go on and let's see if we can work around and if we can perform this operation, if we can exactly get the response as we expect. Once you run this, you get this entire JSON data. Now remember, because I'm using ice cream, it'll print this entire JSON data in a beautiful way. It'll pretty print it. There's a module called pretty print, but that's something we'll see ahead. But this is an alternative of it as well. You can see this is in a beautiful way where you get to know where a particular um, dictionary or list ends and where the next one begins, because it follows indentation accordingly. This is what we get to see. This is the JSON content we have. I'm just going to store this in our case as JSON response equals response.json. And this is the default way or default method of how we generally access a web page to send a request, perform some operation over the web page, and get a response. If you have any query on this till here, please feel free to let me know if there are any queries. I'll just be on mute while I share this code meanwhile. If there are no queries, we will move ahead. So please take a few seconds, just walk through this. You can execute it simultaneously as well. Any queries, feel free to let me know.